Some crimes are solved in hours. Others remain mysteries for decades. And then there are the cases that were never what they seemed. I'm the Decoder. Welcome to True Crime Decoder, where we break down the evidence, expose the deception, and decode the stories behind the world's most fascinating crimes, scams, cyber attacks, and unsolved mysteries. If you enjoy fact-based investigations and documentary-style storytelling, consider subscribing. We uncover new cases every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now every clue matters. Every detail tells a story. Let's decode today's case. Pickup truck, sitting alone in an apartment parking lot. Not broken down, not abandoned for long, just still there, hours after its owner should have driven it home. That single detail, one vehicle where two should have been, is the first thread in a case that investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Tennessee's history. On paper, it starts as something almost boring. A young couple who didn't show up to a party. But pull that thread, and it unravels into a stolen SUV wiped clean of its owner's life, a house that reeked of bleach and decay, and a trail of evidence so damning that a single fingerprint on an envelope would end up deciding everything. This is the case of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Let's decode it. Knoxville, Tennessee, January 2007. It's the kind of city that doesn't usually make national headlines. A college town built around the University of Tennessee, quiet neighborhoods, family-run diners, the sort of place where a Saturday night means dinner with friends and maybe a party afterward. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that requires planning beyond what to wear and whose car to take. Channon Christian was 21 years old, a senior at the University of Tennessee studying sociology. She'd grown up close to her family, worked 2 jobs throughout her degree, and had recently bought herself a brand new Toyota 4Runner. Something she was proud of, something she'd earned. Friends described her as warm, sociable, the type who collected friendships easily and kept them. Christopher Newsom was 23, a Knoxville native who'd gone from being a standout high school baseball player into a steady career in carpentry and construction. He was easygoing, hands-on, the kind of person who made small handmade gifts for family members just because. The two of them had been together for about 3 months by that January. Knew enough that the relationship still had that showing up everywhere together energy. Established enough that both families already knew each other's names. On the evening of January 6th, their plans were about as ordinary as plans get. Dinner together, then a birthday party with friends. Nothing about that Saturday hinted at what was coming. Channon had spent part of the day at her best friend Carr's apartment at the Washington Ridge complex, getting ready for the night ahead. Christopher had been out golfing for most of the afternoon before heading over to meet her. It was a normal day right up until it wasn't. Neither of them showed up to the party. At first, nobody panicked. Plans change, people run late, phones die. But as the night stretched into early morning and neither Channon nor Christopher could be reached, that casual assumption started to erode. By the next morning, Shannon's mother went to check on her daughter's room, expecting to find her asleep after a late night. Instead, she found a bed that hadn't been touched. No sign her daughter had come home at all. Around the same time, Christopher's family was hitting the same wall. Call after call going straight to voicemail. Here's the detail that mattered most in those early hours. When friends went looking for the couple that night, they found Christopher's pickup truck still parked outside the Washington Ridge apartment complex. But Shannon's Toyota 4Runner, the one she'd worked 2 jobs to afford, was gone. That single fact told investigators 2 things almost immediately. First, Christopher had made it to the apartment complex that evening, which meant whatever happened after the 2 of them were already together. Second, wherever they ended up, it wasn't the party, and it wasn't home. Something had gone wrong somewhere in that gap of time between getting ready at Carr's and meeting friends downtown. A gap that, as the hours dragged on, felt less like a delay and more like a disappearance. Both families contacted police almost immediately. But because Channon and Christopher were both legal adults, officers explained they'd need to wait 24 hours before officially filing a missing persons report. It's a standard policy designed to prevent wasted resources on cases that resolve themselves. But for 2 families who already sensed, in that instinctive way parents often describe, that something had gone seriously wrong, That waiting period cost them a full day without any official support. So they did what desperate families do, they searched on their own. Apartment complexes, hospitals, police stations, even homeless shelters, chasing any scrap of information that might explain where their children had gone. What they found instead only deepened the dread. While both families searched independently, a discovery was quietly being made a few miles away. One that, at first, nobody connected to the missing couple at all. On the morning of January 7th, a railway maintenance worker doing routine track inspection near a stretch of line in Knoxville noticed something out of place near the rails. From a distance, it looked like debris. A bundle wrapped in fabric, discarded and forgotten. It wasn't debris. As the worker got closer, he realized he was looking at human remains, badly burned and difficult to immediately identify. Authorities were called to the scene right away. Because of the condition of the body, there was no fast way to confirm who it belonged to. But once word of Channon and Christopher's disappearance reached investigators, the timing and location were too close to ignore. Meanwhile, and completely unaware of what had been found near the tracks, both families pressed on with their own search. Using cell tower data pulled from Channon's phone provider, a level of access that today's privacy protections would make far more difficult to obtain, they were able to trace her phone's last known signal to a cell tower near Cherry Street, roughly 6 miles from the apartment complex where she and Christopher had vanished. They went there, and they found her forerunner. But it didn't look right. The license plates had been removed entirely. Personal belongings, photographs, a childhood teddy bear, her iPod were all missing from inside. The floors, usually kept clean, were dirty. The driver's seat had been pushed back far further than someone Channon's height would ever need. And sitting in the center console, almost carelessly left behind, was a pack of cigarettes. Neither Channon nor Christopher smoked. Every detail told the same story. Someone else had been driving this car. Someone had stripped it of anything that connected it back to her, and then simply left it a few streets from home, as if it no longer mattered. Back at the crime lab, forensic examiners were finally able to properly examine the body recovered near the railway tracks. What they found was worse than anyone had feared. The victim, a young man in his 20s, had been bound, gagged, and severely beaten before being shot 3 times. In the back, the neck, and the head. Afterward, his body had been set on fire in what appeared to be a deliberate, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to destroy evidence. The body was confirmed to be Christopher. His parents were advised not to view his remains. The damage was that severe. All they could do, according to those close to the family, was hold the body bag that contained him. For Channon's family, Christopher's discovery didn't bring relief. It brought a much darker, much more urgent question. If this is what happened to him, what happened to her? From that point forward, the search for Channon Christian stopped being a missing persons case in the usual sense. It became a race against time, with investigators fully aware that every hour that passed made a safe outcome less and less likely. As forensic examiners processed Channon's abandoned SUV, they found something wedged between the seats that would end up breaking the entire case open. An envelope addressed to a house just 2 blocks from where the vehicle had been dumped. And on that envelope, a single, clear fingerprint. Run through the automated fingerprint identification system, the print matched a man named Lamarcus Davidson, a recently released offender with prior convictions for carjacking and aggravated robbery. It was, in hindsight, a staggering oversight for someone with his level of criminal experience, and it's the kind of detail that changes an entire investigation overnight. Officers moved on the address immediately. With Channon still missing, and the very real possibility that she could be inside that house, alive, they didn't wait for a response at the door. They forced their way in. What they found inside confirmed they were exactly where they needed to be. In one room, Christopher's driver's license and his baseball cap. In another, Channon's handbag and iPod, along with the shoes she'd been wearing that night. Still, there was no sign of Channon herself. Then, moving into the kitchen, officers were hit with 2 distinct and unmistakable smells. Bleach, and underneath it, decay. In the corner of the room sat a black trash can. Inside it, wrapped in a dirty white sheet over a stack of garbage bags, was Channon. She had suffered severe injuries, much of it inflicted while she was still alive, and her body had been doused in bleach in what investigators believe was another attempt to erase forensic evidence. It didn't work. DNA and fingerprint evidence recovered from her body and from the surrounding scene would go on to connect at least 5 separate individuals to what had happened inside that house. With Lamarcus Davidson identified as a suspect, investigators moved quickly, and it didn't take long before a second name surfaced. Eric Boyd, a known associate of Davidson's, with phone records showing multiple calls between the two men on the night Channon and Christopher disappeared. Boyd was pulled over and brought in for questioning. Initially, he claimed he barely knew Davidson at all, a story that collapsed almost instantly once investigators laid his own phone records on the table in front of him. Faced with the evidence, Boyd's account shifted, and he told police that Davidson might be hiding out in a second, vacant property on the edge of town. A house the two of them had allegedly burglarized around the same time Channon and Christopher went missing. Officers moved on that address too, and found Davidson holed up inside, surrounded by discarded food packaging and trash, clearly having been living there for days. But one detail stood out immediately. Despite the squalor around him, his shoes were spotless. A pair of sneakers that, it turned out, belonged to Christopher. Once in custody, Davidson's story changed repeatedly. Investigators would later count at least 5 different versions of events, each one shifting blame further away from himself and toward others. Eventually, he named his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and a third man, George Thomas. During follow-up interviews, a fourth name surfaced, an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa Coleman, bringing the total number of people connected to the crime to 5. Piecing together 5 conflicting accounts against the available forensic evidence proved difficult, but investigators eventually built a picture of what happened that night that lined up with the physical evidence recovered at the scene. According to the most consistent account, Davidson and Cobbins had approached Channon and Christian at gunpoint outside the Washington Ridge apartment complex, forced them into Shannon's SUV, and driven them to a rental house on Chipman Street. From there, the stories diverge in ways that matter less than what the forensic evidence ultimately confirmed. DNA recovered at the scene linked both Cobbins and Davidson directly to Channon, and evidence showed that both victims had been taken into the property together that night. Christopher was later removed from the house, driven to the railway tracks, and killed. Channon was held inside the house for roughly 2 days before her death. Vanessa Coleman would later claim she had little to no real involvement in what happened, suggesting at points that she herself had feared for her safety. Investigators pointed to inconsistencies in that account, including her own written reflections from the days that followed, which did not read like the private thoughts of someone who believed she had been held against her will. Between 2008 and 2009, each of the 5 defendants faced trial separately. Davidson, identified by prosecutors as the driving force behind the crime, was convicted and sentenced to death, along with additional years added on top of that sentence. Cobbins was convicted of first-degree murder and received life without parole. George Thomas faced many of the same charges and, while he avoided the death penalty, was also sentenced to life without parole. Vanessa Coleman's case was more complex, since prosecutors had to prove precisely what role she'd played rather than simply what she'd witnessed. She was ultimately acquitted of first-degree murder, but convicted on lesser charges connected to kidnapping, assault, and Shannon's death, receiving a sentence of 53 years. Eric Boyd, tried separately and earlier than the others on federal charges related to concealing a known fugitive, received an 18-year sentence in 2008. For a moment, it looked as though the legal side of this case had reached its conclusion. Then, in 2011, everything the families had believed was settled came apart again. The judge who had presided over most of these trials resigned after it was revealed he had been buying prescription drugs from convicted offenders who had appeared before his own court, a revelation compounded by separate allegations of misconduct. Given how central his role had been throughout the original proceedings, the credibility of every verdict he'd overseen was now in question. The result was a wave of retrials, forcing the victims' families to relive the entire ordeal all over again. Davidson and Cobbins' convictions were ultimately upheld without a new trial, but both George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman were granted retrials. Thomas was convicted again in his second trial, though this time his sentence was revised, shifting from life without parole to the possibility of parole after 51 years. Coleman's retrial concluded in 2013 with a reduced sentence of 35 years, 18 years less than what she'd originally received. And then there was Eric Boyd, whose story wasn't finished either. Years after serving time on his original federal charges, he was tried again in 2019, this time facing state-level murder, rape, kidnapping, and robbery charges connected to both victims. He was convicted on nearly all counts and sentenced to 2 life terms plus an additional 90 years, a staggering escalation from the 18-year sentence he'd initially received. It would take 12 years, 2 separate rounds of trials, and a judicial scandal involving the very judge meant to ensure justice was served, before this case reached anything resembling a final legal conclusion. What makes this case so difficult to sit with isn't just the brutality of what happened to Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. It's how close the entire case came to unraveling years after the fact. A single fingerprint on an envelope was the difference between an unsolved disappearance and a full conviction. And a single judge's misconduct nearly undid years of prosecution built on that evidence. Channon and Christopher had nothing more than an ordinary Saturday night planned. Dinner, a party, the kind of evening that happens in thousands of households every single week. Instead, their case became one of the most brutal in Tennessee's history, and one that took over a decade to formally close. If this case affected you the way it affected me, let me know in the comments, particularly your thoughts on how close a judicial scandal came to undoing an entire case built on solid forensic evidence. I'm the Decoder. If you want more fact-based investigations like this one, make sure you're subscribed. We decode a new case every single week. Until next time, stay sharp and keep decoding.